In this video, we will be covering the steps to accept differences using project settings and acceptance rules. Before we get started, it's important to understand the benefit of using these settings and rules. When STREAMdiff identifies something as different, like we'll see with the phone number in a little bit, or let's say it identifies a logo on multiple pages shifting by only a few pixels, it's nice to be able to see or view that difference. However, since those differences can be numerous and repeat on other pages, it can be very time-consuming if you have to verify each difference every time. Therefore, using the project settings and acceptance rules, you are able to verify the difference once or maybe a couple times, and unless that difference is changed in a different manner, STREAMdiff will know to ignore it, so you don't have to verify it on every page. In addition, if there are areas on the page that you don't want to check for differences or only want to check for differences, rules can be set up to ignore or check these areas as well. So let's get started. To begin, you'll want to set up a new project from scratch or open an existing STREAMdiff Compare project like the one you see on the screen now. In addition, if you don't already have the tooltip option turned on from the View menu, you'll want to turn that on as well. And to do that, simply just go to the View menu and click on the very last option called Difference List Tooltip. This will be very helpful when looking at the differences and determining what the actual difference or attribute that changed is. So we'll start by talking about the different project settings, then get into some acceptance rule options. So if we take a look at our current compare results, let's take a closer look at the variable image difference or category down here in the lower left. So again, if I double click on my variable image category, STREAMdiff will, in the table directly across from the categories, put a row for every image difference. You can see we have one row here now. And you'll notice that the X position attribute is highlighted in red, telling us that that has changed or different. And if we hover our mouse over that, you can see the tooltip that pops up. And this is the benefit of turning the tooltip on. If you didn't have this, you wouldn't get this tooltip. So this tooltip is great because it shows us the value of the control file, which is 149. So in the control file, this image has an X positional value of 149 in pixels. And in the test file, that changed to 179 for a difference of 30. So it does the math for you in that tooltip. So very helpful to see by exactly how many pixels that logo shifted. So let's go ahead and create or change some project settings to ignore that shift. The assumption is that this logo shifting by 30 pixels is acceptable, it's okay. In X and Y shifting is something that you're going to see, I think, quite often as you compare more files. It's just a very common type of difference, a slight X and Y positional shift. So there's a couple different project settings that we can use to ignore that. So if we go to our settings, project settings menu, we'll go to the search and tolerances tab, and the options that we're going to be working with here are in the upper left, global tolerances. So you can see the first two options under global tolerances, we have an area here for a horizontal X and a vertical Y tolerance. So let's say I enter a value of 30 pixels because that's what the image did shift by in the X axis. If I enter 30 pixels in that global tolerance and refresh or recompare my pages, STREAMdiff will ignore up to a 30 pixel shift on the X axis for everything. When I say everything, I mean images, text, graphics, anything that visually shifts by putting 30 pixels in this setting here. It's a global setting, so it'll affect everything. And you have to be careful with that because in this case, the image shifted by 30 pixels, but nothing else did. So if we kept this setting to 30, there's a chance that we could miss some shifting on this page or other pages as we continue through our compare. So in this scenario, 30 pixel shift for the global tolerance is not the best way to accept this. In a lot of cases where you have a lot of shifting on all the pages, then global tolerances make a lot of sense. But in this case, it's not the best or safest way to accept that. So I'm going to just set that back to 0 and click the button directly below that called Advanced Tolerances. When we go into the advanced tolerances, they work very much like the global tolerances, but you can see here that we have different categories for the advanced tolerances. We have a text tolerances area here at the top, followed by image, graphic, and then page tolerances. So these are global tolerances, but at the category level. So you can see now in text tolerances or image, I have all the different attributes for text, image, and graphic differences. And since we're talking about an image difference, if I go to the image tolerances and now put a 30 pixel tolerance on the X position here, that will only ignore that shifting for images. And in this scenario, that's the better way to ignore that shifting, because I'm only going to ignore images. If I look at other pages and see other tolerances that I may have to set, I can always come back in here and change them. But for right now, the only thing that we're seeing shifting is the image, so it makes the most sense to just set that tolerance at the image level versus a global level where everything would be ignored. All right, so if we click the OK button, click OK again, and anytime you change project settings or create rules, it's a good idea to refresh or recompare the pages. If you click yes here, it's going to recompare all 20 pages. One option though is if you click no, you can manually refresh this page, and you can do that by either clicking this button in the upper right, the recompare page button. If we click that, it'll refresh the page, or you can just double click on any page here in the list. Since we're on page 1, if I double click page 1, that will also refresh that page. And by refreshing that page, it now applies that 30 pixel tolerance to the image. That is why you don't see that red arrow now pointing by the image. The difference is still there. We've just told STREAMdiff, ignore up to a 30 pixel tolerance on the x-axis for only images. So that's an example of how we can use those global tolerances or advanced tolerances to ignore things like shifting and slight differences for the other attributes. All right, and if we navigate to the second page, we have some graphic differences on this page. And the one that I want to point out is this fourth one here. And that happens to be this graphic line just below the portfolio summary section. So this is a graphic difference, and this graphic difference shifts on the Y position by 18 pixels. So what I want to point out there is you can see we're still catching other shifting for different categories. We're ignoring the image, but any other shifting for things like this graphic on the y-axis is being caught. So again, that's the benefit of being very specific when we set those tolerances, being specific to the category and not everything globally. If we had set a global tolerance for the X or Y axis, there's a chance that we can miss some of the shifting like we see here with that graphic line. So again, important to be as specific as possible when we're setting those tolerances. All right, so moving on, let's go to page 5 and take a look at a different type of difference and a different project setting that we can use to accept or ignore that difference. So on page 5, there's a lot of text, and if we have some text differences here, we can see with the red X next to our variable text category. So we'll just double click on that. And as soon as I do that, you'll see a lot of red arrows showing up by the text. Essentially, almost everything on this page is different. And to look at what's different, we're going to want to focus down here in this bottom table. Again, we have a separate row for each individual text difference, and there's a lot of them. But what's consistent about most of these is the font and care set attribute. You can see this column here is red. And again, the benefit of having the tooltip is if we hover over one of those, we can see exactly what the font changed from to in the test file. And if we look very closely at that column, we can see that there was a font change, specifically a font name change. In our control file, which is the value at the top of that tooltip, we can see that the font applied to this text is Myriad Pro. And in the test file, it changed to Arial Narrow. So again, very easy with this tooltip. I can kind of scroll down and hover over a number of these, and the majority of this text has a font name change. So there's a project setting that we can use to accept this. Now, obviously, you could create individual rules, but since there's almost hundreds of these individual differences, you wouldn't want to create hundreds of rules for this. There's a very easy global project setting that we can set that will ignore this for us. So again, we're changing from Myriad Pro to Arial Narrow. So to do that, we'll go back to our project settings. So settings, project settings, and we'll click on the global font acceptance tab. And at the top of that menu, there's a drop-down box under acceptance. You can see global font acceptance. If we click on that drop-down menu, none is the default, meaning it's off. It's going to catch font name changes. But then there's 3 options below that. The first option is all names. So if we select all names, that will ignore all font name differences for all the text throughout our document and throughout our compare. So only the name difference, nothing else. The second option is all attributes. That will ignore all font names in addition to any of these font attributes you see here down at the lower right. Font resolution, font height. So right now, none of those attributes changed. So we wouldn't want to select all attributes because they didn't change. And again, we want to be as specific as possible when we're accepting differences. Accept what's changed now, don't accept what may change in the future. So we don't want to accept all attributes. And then the third option is selected. Selected actually gives you a separate drop-down box from the control and test. And I can actually go through and locate Myriad Pro here, which is my control font. And then it changed to Arial Narrow on the test side. I can select that there. If I did want to accept the attributes, I could. I don't want to in this case. And I can click the add button, and that's going to add that font acceptance rule to this table for me. So now when I refresh my page, STREAMdiff is going to ignore that specific font change, which is a better option than just ignoring all names, because if fonts change on different pages, I would like to know about it. So again, be specific when you're creating these rules and changing these project settings. So we'll click OK. I'm going to click on No again and just refresh page 5. When I do that, notice how much of those red arrows disappear. Almost all of them. Now there's 3 or 4 or 5 differences I still have to focus on here, but for the most part, those are either expositional changes or actually some actual data differences that are showing up here. But we've created a rule to accept the font name change. We're only accepting this specific font name scenario, and you can see how easy it was to do that and clean up this page 5. So again, that kind of covers some of the global font acceptance settings. When you have name changes or things like the font attributes change, you can use those global settings to ignore that. All right, the last set of project settings that I want to focus on are called filters. If we go back into our settings, project settings menu, and the very last tab at the top is our filters tab. Filters are a great way for filtering out what you see and what you want to compare in your STREAMdiff project. So you can see at the top, there's a visual section followed by a compare section, and then a number of different checkboxes within there. Under the visual section, this allows you to filter out visually anything that you don't want to see. So for example, let's just say you want to do a simple text compare, and you have images and graphics in your document, but you don't want to see them. So if you check the graphics and check the images boxes and refresh your page or recompare your pages, STREAMdiff will visually only show you text. It'll filter out the images and graphics. And then it's the same idea with the settings below that. For the compare settings, let's say you don't even want to compare images or graphics, you want to just compare text. If you check the images and graphic checkboxes, we'll click OK. Let STREAMdiff rerun all 20 of those pages. And the next time it displays the results, look how different our page 1 looks. It doesn't have the logo on the top left, and it doesn't have any graphics or shading. It's only showing us text. And that's reflected down in the categories in the lower left as well. You can see here, variable text is really our only main category that's showing up because we're filtering out the images and graphics. So using these visual and compare filters, it's a great way to focus on very specific categories and only see specific things when you're reviewing your results. All right, we'll go back and turn those on. So again, going back to our filters tab, just uncheck those like so. All right. And then the last set of advanced compare filters I want to talk about are at the very bottom. If we click this advanced compare filters button, this brings up a window that allows us at an attribute level to filter out specific attributes. So you can see the different tabs across the top: text, image, graphics, non-visual, which is specific for AFP files, and then page. And as you click through here, you'll see these are all the different attributes that show up in this table down here at the bottom. So text, it shows you all the different text attributes that STREAMdiff checks for. And sometimes several of these attributes can change and you're okay with it. So these checkboxes allow you to ignore very specific things. Like for example, if you didn't want to look at X and Y position for text, you could check those checkboxes. And if you also don't want to look at the color, you can check that checkbox as well. So using these different checkboxes for the text, image, graphics, and non-visual and page, you can get very specific on what you want to ignore. And there's some cases where an acceptance rule, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, it's difficult sometimes to create a rule when multiple of these attributes are changing. So sometimes it's easier just to filter them out here using these advanced compare filters. Okay, that concludes using the project settings to accept differences. Now let's move on to creating acceptance rules. Okay, so I've set my project back to its default values now. So the project looks as if it were set up from scratch. So we'll now talk about different acceptance rules. We covered already how to accept differences with the project settings. Now we're going to focus on creating individual rules and ignoring specific areas when there are differences present. So we'll start by looking at the variable text differences that we have on this page. And again, we're going to look at this phone number area and focus on that for a few minutes. And you can see that the phone number changed from 304 as an area code to 591. Again, the tooltip is, again, very nice to have us be able to see that very easily here. So we know that changed. Now, there is no project setting that will ignore just those first three numbers. Obviously, we could use the advanced filters to filter out text data, but that would ignore the entire text, not just those three numbers. So this is a great example of where you would want to create an individual acceptance rule. So let's step through those steps to do that. So we'll start by, in our acceptance rules window in the top left up here, we'll start by right-clicking and clicking on the very first option, Add Acceptance Rules Set. All right, an acceptance rules set is essentially just a folder that we're going to create the rules in. So when we're creating these folders, it really is up to you how you want to group these rules. I typically group the rules based on their page number. So I'll set this one and call it page 1 rules, for example. But if you prefer to group those by types of differences and things like that, entirely up to you. Just try to be as descriptive as possible. So when you have multiple folders, it's very easy for you to know which rules are in those folders. So we'll create that folder and then just click OK. And you can see we now have our page 1 rules folder up here in the top left. So that's the first step. The second step is to tell STREAMdiff when and where you want to apply these rules. And the way that we do that is by creating what we call a trigger. A trigger is essentially some text on this page that's going to tell STREAMdiff that when I see that text, apply the rules that are in this folder. So for example, page numbers are great to use because they're very specific to types of pages. Another good example would be this, your quarterly portfolio review header on this page. I know that in these files, that header or that text only shows up on the first page. And right now I'm creating rules for the first page. So this would be a good identifier to tell STREAMdiff where to apply the rules for page 1. And the way that you set this as your trigger or identifier is you can either draw a box around that text or just click that text, and once it's highlighted, just click and drag that up to your page 1 rules folder to the top left. Now when you're dragging this, try to put the cursor right on top of that blue anchor or right on top of the name of your folder. And once you do that, you get the acceptance rules trigger window. And again, try to be as descriptive as possible, or if you want to just call this trigger page 1, that's fine too. It shows you the value that you're using the trigger, and we'll click OK there. So after creating that trigger, you'll notice if we look at our folder now, look at how the folder has a red box around it. That tells us that this folder is now ready for rules to be created for page 1, and those rules are going to be applied to page 1. If we navigate to page 2, notice now if we look at our folder, that red box disappears. So that red box is a good identifier of whether or not your rules are going to be applied to certain pages. Because we picked a trigger or that text specific to page 1, we expect our rules only to be applied on page 1. Now there are certain scenarios where you want rules to be applied to all pages or a couple different types of pages, but for right now, our focus is just creating rules to be applied to a specific page. So if we go back to page 1, we then again have that red box around our folder, so we know that the rules are now ready to go or be created for this page 1. So focusing on that phone number difference, the third step is to actually create the rule for that phone number difference. And the way that we create the rule is we drag the phone number difference from the table down here at the bottom. To create the rule, you do not drag from the control and test windows. You drag it from this table down here at the bottom. So we'll just select that second row and drag it up to our page 1 rules folder. And once we do that, we need to get the following pop-up window. We'll give it a name, and again, try to be as descriptive as possible. So we'll just call this phone number rule. All right, and then underneath acceptance type, there's 3 different categories. The first category, the blue ABC, is a data change. So this is the setting to accept the data change. The second one is to accept a font change or a font difference for this text. And then the third one is to accept a color difference for this text. And notice how the font and the color say report difference. That essentially means no. You do not want to accept the font or the color because in this scenario, the font or the color did not change. But the first one, to accept a data difference, Yes, accept only this difference. And if we click on the drop down, you can see there's one additional option. So report difference again means no, don't accept it. Accept only this difference means accept only this scenario that we see right here. So in this example, that's the area code changing from 304 to 591. It's only going to accept that. If the phone number changes differently on a different page, it's going to catch that difference, which is what we want in this case. The second option, though, is accept all differences. If you select accept all differences, that would tell STREAMdiff to ignore or accept any phone number variation, which in some cases you may want to do, but in this case, we only want to accept that specific phone number. So we're going to change that to accept only this difference in this case. And we'll click on the OK button. And if I look in the upper left-hand corner, if we expand with the plus sign, our folder, you can see we have our folder. We've created our trigger for page 1, and now we have our phone number rule. And if I refresh this page now, and you can refresh the page by either using the refresh or recompare page button up here at the top, or just by double clicking on page 1, it now refreshes the page, and you'll notice that the phone number arrow disappears. Now, the phone number is still highlighted in red, and the purpose of that is to show you where there was a difference that's been accepted. So that tells you there was a difference at that location, but one of the acceptance rules accepted it. So it's good to know where those areas are as you're looking at the results and navigating through the GUI. Okay, so that's an example of how to create an individual acceptance rule. And the nice thing about the folder and the triggers, once you have your folder and trigger created, like we do here for page 1, there's one additional text difference down here at the bottom. This happens to be some invisible text that shows up here at the top of the page. Once you have your folder and trigger, though, created for a specific page, like we do here, then all you have to do is just drag more differences if you want to accept them. So if we want to accept this additional text difference, just drag it up to our folder, give this a name, visible text rule. And again, it's a data difference, so we're going to only want to accept that data difference. Click OK, and if we refresh our page now, that difference also disappears. Notice how page 1 now went green. It was red, but it went to green because we've accepted the logo change earlier with the project setting, and now we've accepted the 2 text differences here with acceptance rules. And again, if you click on those, it'll show you exactly where those acceptance rules are being applied. All right, so that covers individual acceptance rules for individual differences. Okay, so the next type of rule that we're going to talk about is a mask rule. A mask rule allows you to mask an entire area and ignore everything inside that area. It's a great example or great uses when you know areas are going to change, maybe a time and date stamp, things like that, a watermark. You know the things are going to be in a certain location, they're going to always be there. Rather than create individual rules, you can just mask out those entire areas. It's also a great fit for when you have multiple differences within an area. So if we go to page 2, a great example of that is this barcode down here at the bottom. You can see that this barcode is actually several graphic lines. And if we didn't mask this area out, you would have to create a separate acceptance rule for every single one. So potentially hundreds of rules just to get every single graphic line. In this example, we know that this barcode change is acceptable. So we want to go ahead and just create a rule to mask that so it's no longer flagged as a difference. And the way that we do that is now that we're on page 2, we're going to just kind of step through and create our folder again. So I'll call my page 2 rules folder. And then I have to create my trigger so that STREAMdiff knows I'm on page 2 and to only apply that rule on page 2. And for that, I'm going to use the page number. So I'm just going to select the number 2 down here and drag it up to my page 2 rules folder. And we'll just call this page 2 trigger, like so. All right, when I have my red box around my folder, I know I'm ready to go and I can create my mask rule. So before we create the mask rule, it's important that in the acceptance rules window, if you right click, you're going to want to select this prompt for rule type selection. Make sure that that option is turned on. That will help you select the correct rule here in a second. And the way that we create a mask then is holding down the control key on your keyboard. You can just draw a specific area that you want to ignore. So for example, I can just draw this area here, and STREAMdiff will ignore everything within this area here that I defined. So to create the actual mask rule, keep holding the control key down. If you click and drag that area up to the page 2 rules, like so, it asks you what type of rule you want to create. And in this example, we're going to create a mask rule. We're going to cover this second example, region compare rule, next. But for right now, we're going to want to create a mask rule. If we click OK, we'll just give this a name, barcode mask, for example. The middle area here just kind of shows you the size of that rectangle. And then down at the bottom, you can decide what you want to accept in that rectangle. On the left-hand side, you can see the three main categories are text, graphic, and images. In this scenario, we did not have any text in this area, and we didn't have any image in that area, so only graphics. So again, be specific when you're creating these rules and masks. You want to only accept what's currently different. And in this case, there's only graphics that are currently present. So important to pick that there. Then the second set of options, contained and touched. Contained will ignore any graphic that's fully contained in that mask area, and touched will ignore anything that also touches that area. So we're going to select contained because it's the safest right now. We don't want something to accidentally touch that mask rule area and automatically be ignored. So we want to catch that. So for right now, we're going to select contained. When I click OK, you can see how STREAMdiff now creates a gray box around that mask area, so we can easily see what area we've masked out. And when I refresh my page by either double clicking on the page number or using my recompare button up here at the top, you can see now that that entire area is ignored. This is a case where the graphic lines did change. We were okay with that, and we thought the best way to accept that would be to create a mask because we could accept multiple differences within one area. So a great fit here for this barcode. Again, areas that you know are going to change or anticipate there's going to be changes or have multiple changes, the mask is a great way to ignore those areas. And the last type of acceptance rule we're going to talk about is called a region compare rule. For the region compare rule, I'm going to navigate to page 7. And page 7 just happens to be another first page or beginning of one of my documents. You can see here. And because it is, you can see that this page 1 rules folder in the top left is already active. We've created that, so we don't have to create another folder and trigger. We can just reuse this one that is currently working for page 1. So the area that we're going to focus on for this is this middle area here, this accounts included in your portfolio. So what I'm going to do is hold my control key down, and just like I would do for a mask, and I'm going to highlight this entire area like there. And I'm going to hold my control key down again and click anywhere in this box that we've defined and drag that up to my page 1 rules folder. And this time when I get the rule selection option, I'm going to select region compare rule and click OK. Okay, we'll just call this region 1 right now. And then if we look at the bottom, we can select if we want to do a contained or touched region. Again, contained is going to look at everything inside the region. Touched is going to look at everything inside and anything that touches the region. And the difference between a mask and a region compare rule is a mask rule tells STREAMdiff to ignore certain areas. The region compare rule, though, tells STREAMdiff only to look in certain areas. So what you're going to see here is when I click OK, you're going to see the entire page gets grayed out except for the area that I'm selecting here, except for the region area, this green area. Everything else in the page is being ignored. The only thing that we're looking at on this page is this middle area that I've defined as my region compare. And if we look at the differences in there, you can see that we have this amount difference that changed. So that difference is there. Everything else on the page has been ignored, like the phone number difference we saw, like the logo. Those areas are all being ignored. So that's the main difference between a mask, which ignores certain areas, and a region compare, which looks at certain areas but ignores the rest of the page. And you can create multiple region compare areas. For example, if we wanted to also include our phone number area, we could again hold our control key down, draw a box around the area we want to look at, and drag that up to our page 1 rules, select region compare again, and we'll just call this region 2 and click OK. When we do that, now you can see that shows that area as well. So now it's looking in this area. So using these region compare rules, if you want to compare only specific parts of your page or document, you can create these rules. STREAMdiff will ignore everything else, but just look in those specific areas for differences. Okay, so that's a brief overview of the different types of acceptance rules and project settings. The neat thing with acceptance rules is once you have acceptance rules created, if you right-click in the acceptance rules window, so if you right-click here, down at the very bottom, there's an acceptance rules export and import option. So if you have similar documents or similar projects and you want to reuse these acceptance rules, you can export those. It'll save the rules to a file. You can then create a new project and then simply just import those same acceptance rules and reuse them. This concludes the STREAMdiff Accepting Differences video. If you have questions on any of the topics covered or any other support-related matter, please contact the Paloma support team. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day.